That is my cue. Good evening, everyone. I am Professor Ian Gadd, and I'm here in multiple guises, although, as you can tell, I'm not off to watch birds, given my current dress. I am a colleague of Stephen's, and I'll introduce him shortly. I am also the convener, one of three conveners that plan out our literature and humanities talks. And just on cue, Sue, one of my fellow conveners, has just come into the room. You will have had your name ticked off a list by her earlier this evening. And then the third reason, or the third guise I have, which explains my dress, is I'm chair of the board here at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. And it's been a busy day today. We've been inducting new directors to the board. And so on all three levels, as a colleague of Stephen's, as convener of literature and humanities, and as chair of the board, I welcome you all very warmly to this evening's talk. Just before we turn to the thing that you've all come for, I just need to say that there are no plans to run a fire drill. So if we hear alarms, we will need to exit, and to exit we need to go down the stairs and out of the building and out through the front door and turn right and congregate just on the corner of Queen Square and Chapel Row. One more piece of housekeeping before I introduce Stephen formally. We have, I'm pleased to say, a large number of people online. And the wonders of technology mean that they are hearing me and seeing the slides at the same time. Colleagues, friends who are online, if you have any questions for Stephen, please use the chat function in Zoom, and I will make sure that I read out your question in the Q&A. It also means that if any of you here wish to ask a question, I will be asking you to use the roving mic. As somebody who often listens online, the quality of audience questions when they're holding the mic is much better. So both in terms of the sound quality and the intellectual quality, obviously. So please, if you do have a question, please speak into the microphone. So, as I've said, Dr. Stephen Moss is a colleague of mine. I chaired your PhD, Viva, and it was a wonderful afternoon all round. Also, in one of my roles at the university, I oversaw lots of our international exchanges. And Stephen, I'm pleased to say we were able to send you to Namibia, a place you hadn't been to before, with lots of very interesting birds, and which prompted a contribution to Radio 4's from our own correspondence about the ecosystem, the very unique ecosystem there on the coast. As I'm sure you all know, Stephen is one of Britain's leading nature writers and broadcasters. He's very local, based in Somerset, but he's a London boy, and read English at Cambridge before joining the BBC. His TV credits include Springwatch, The Nature of Britain, and Birds Britannia, while his books, actually I don't really need to tell you much about his books because most of them are there and will be available for sale at the end, but they include Wild Hares and Hummingbirds, biographies of the robin, wren, swallow, swan and owl, and the 10 birds that changed the world, for which that particular book has been shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing. Many of you will know him from his monthly Birdwatch column for The Guardian. He's also president of Somerset Wildlife Trust, and hence him being a colleague of mine at Bath Spa, he teaches on the MA in Nature and Travel Writing and has done so for several years. And then the final bit of the biography here, which brings me back to our international connection, a lifelong naturalist. Stephen has travelled to all 7 of the world's continents, 7 of them in search of wildlife. His talk tonight is Mrs. Moreau's Warbler, How Birds Got Their Names. Stephen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian. Thank you ever so much for coming. Not a wet evening. That's a rarity, isn't it, at the moment? And thank you for those of you at home. I hope that you managed to ask some questions, as Ian suggested. Bird names. They're in the news at the moment. Has anyone seen that the American Ornithologists Union, and we have an American here, have decided to change all the bird names? I'm going to come to that later because it's trickier than it sounds, and I'll explain why, although there's some very good ideas there. I'm going to kick off just with a little bit of soothing nature. I'm going to talk about how birds got their names from different aspects of their lives, probably the most notable one being their sound. But before I do that, I just want to kick off. I'm going to do a few short readings from the book, and I'm just going to kick off with the opening because I feel I'm at a lectern in a pulpit somewhere. I shall read the opening of the book in my best biblical voice. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field, and this is important, every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. Genesis, chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. It's barely kicked off, has it? Life on this planet before someone thinks, some bloke thinks, we're going to have to name some birds. It is the oldest profession. There are some other suggestions, but nomenclature, categorization, whatever we want to call it, is the oldest profession. And for many years, I've been fascinated by bird names, and I've given talks on it. And I talked to my agent, and I said, I really want to write a book about bird names. And she said, sounds like a very good long article to me. I said, no, there's definitely a book there. And eventually, and it took a lot of effort, Faber, Guardian Faber, took it on. And the original title, Mrs. Moreau's Warbler, How Birds Got Their Names, became the final title, which is quite unusual in books. Normally you have a working title and then at the very last minute you change it, but I didn't with that one. And I'll explain about Mrs. Moreau later on. But this is going to be an interactive talk. So those of you at home can join in quietly, but those of you here can shout out, and you don't need the mic for this bit. So I'm going to tell you that sound is the primary initial category for bird names. The oldest bird names are virtually all onomatopoeic for obvious reasons, because people didn't have visual aids, they didn't have binoculars, they didn't have cameras, but you can hear a bird sing or call, and those two are of course different things, but you can hear the sounds of birds, and those were often used to give birds their names. So shout out a bird named after the sound it makes. Right, that'll do. Well, interestingly, because you're obviously an expert audience, you didn't start, some of you did, but that's fine. The obvious one is, of course, cuckoo. Although, interestingly, cuckoo isn't the original name for cuckoo. The original name was gowk. And Jeff Sample, who lives up in Northumberland, and is a very fine sound recordist, once told me that when he was a kid, and it was really in the 50s and 60s, so relatively recently, daft old gowk was a term of sort of endearment. I mean, silly old fool, daft old gowk. Gowk is also onomatopoeic, it's just not as good as cuckoo. I've heard one today. I do a cycle ride every morning, 6 miles around the village to get fit. And I heard a chiff-chaff very briefly. Weird now. Chiff-chaffs sing in autumn, obviously, because it's getting very warm. I love the name chiff-chaff. In the old Collins Peterson, Mountfort and Hollandfield Guide, remember that one? Back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, they had every bird name had it in French, Swedish, Dutch, and German. And Schiffchaff is Zilp in German, Gif Jaff in Dutch, and in French it is, of course, Mosquitero Commun. Oh no, that's French. Sorry, I can't remember what it is in. That's Spanish. Sorry, I can't remember what it is in French, but it's not anything onomatopoeic, which just shows that it doesn't always work. And the other bird named after its call, a seabird. Now, those three are very obvious. And I do say in this book that people often say to me, oh, you don't have the folk names anymore, do you? When I was a kid, we used to call it a peewit. Lapwings were called peewits, yeah? Don't have folk names. What are cuckoo, chiffchaff, and kittiwake if they're not folk names? Because they certainly weren't created by scientists. Many bird names were, I'll come to that, but these early names are folk names. And it's interesting with the warblers that warblers are tricky little birds that are quite hard to tell apart from each other. The three that have a distinctive name that doesn't have warbler in it are chiffchaff from the call and blackcap and whitethroat from the very obvious field marks that you would be able to see even without binoculars. Whereas willow warbler, by far the commonest, obviously that isn't a folk name, that's a scientific name, it's a name created by scientists. But the birds that do have, the crow family is brilliant for this. All the crows, virtually, apart from magpie and jay, but all the sort of obvious crows have onomatopoeic names. Rook. How do you know, by the way, and I nicked this from Dominic Cousins, my friend and fellow bird writer, who's really good at this. How do you know if you saw a single black bird fly overhead, you haven't got your binoculars, you know it's a rook or a carrion crow, how do you know if it calls which one it is? Because a rook sounds like a crow who's been sent on an anger management course. Listen. This will take a bit. But my favourite, by far, people asked me the other day, I was at Wells Literary Festival and someone asked the classic question, it's a good question, what's your favourite bird? Used to be swift when I lived in London for over 40 years. Then I moved to the country and I went a bit native and swallow suddenly took over. But raven is very high on my list now, partly because it's the opening chapter of 10 Birds That Changed the World. And it's a great bird. In Icelandic, that is hrafn. Now, how do we know that these names are so old? Because obviously they weren't written down until about the 14th, 15th century, most of them. There's a few examples from the Anglo-Saxon times of bird names, there's about 25, I think, that were written down. We know because I mentioned that in Icelandic, that's hrafn, and that's from the Old Norse. If you look at a bird like the raven, the rook, and the crow, in all the languages across the Germanic languages like German, Dutch, and English, it's the same word. But more interestingly, it's also the same word in the Scandinavian languages. West Germanic split off from the Scandinavian in about 500 BC. So that means these names are at least 2,500 years old. They're probably 10,000 years old. Yeah, they probably go back much further. And you can imagine the prehistoric hunters going out and seeing a raven fly along with them. And if you want to know why the raven was flying along with them, you need to read 10 Birds That Changed the World, chapter 1 opening. But they would have called up, one of them would have looked up and seen this bird flying and it would have gone, "Arr, rah," and it would have gone, he'd have gone, "Ha, raven, raven." And it became the word raven. People often ask me how certain birds get their names, and they tend to pick common birds, which is perfectly understandable. So sparrow, starling, swan, goose, duck. We have no idea how they got their names because they're not onomatopoeic, but they're so old that we don't know. Modern birds, you know, more recently discovered birds, it's very easy to tell how they got them. But raven is a good example because it's clearly onomatopoeic. But it's not just the raven birds. You know what this bird's called? Chough. So I was a bit puzzled by this because chough sounds like it should be onomatopoeic. But when I first heard choughs back in the 70s in Wales, I heard them. And of course they go. Now, what's that sound like? Chow, chow. The more pedantic amongst you like me will know that there are apparently 12 different ways you can pronounce the letters O-U-G-H in English. One of my favourite being Loch, as in Loch Ness, in Ireland. But chough was clearly initially called the chow, and it was written down as chow, as in plough. And at some point, someone looked at it and went, ha, chough, as in rough. The other misprint, you know the other misprint bird name? Scoter. It's almost certainly a misprint for Sutter, because in German it's Rusente, which is black duck or sooty duck. And yet it's changed. So, blimey, they've heard about it. So that's bird names. The second group of birds, and it's pretty obvious, and I've sort of hinted at it with blackcap and whitethroat. The second set of bird names, and of course these would have overlapped massively, are birds named after their colour. If you took all the birds on the British list, which I did when I was writing this book, which was then about 580, it's now about 630, which do you think would be the most popular colour? Black is one of the two. There's two that more or less tied in. No? No? Red, thank you. All the others are there. You know, there's about, I don't know, 6 or 7 birds with yellow in the name. Yeah, I mean, including things like greater yellow legs and lesser yellow legs, you know. But red and black are the two main ones. Although, of course, this bird was greedy. The black redstart. The reason I wrote this book actually is that I've been fascinated by language longer than, almost as long as I have been with birds. And I studied English at university. I didn't study biology. And I love names. I love naming. Black redstart, my family, half of my family are Italian, and they have a word for black redstart, name for black redstart, which is Codi Rosso Spazzo Camino, which is my favorite bird name because it translates as red-tailed chimney sweep. I present you the black redstart, beautiful bird. And there are lots of other strange things in bird names. Sorry, I'm holding lots of different things. Lots of different shades. There's an awful lot of birds around the world. The more you travel around the world, and I was in Ecuador last week, he said, showing off, and there's an awful lot of birds in South America, particularly, given really odd colour names. So you get violaceous trogon, and violaceous sounds like an anagram of olivaceous, which is the name of a warbler, you know. And these are all different subtle ways of saying green, like greenish or yellowish. And we have a greenish warbler. We have fulvus, we have pallid, we have glaucous gull. Glaucus is a colour, it's a very pale colour. Ferruginous for the ferruginous duck, which means iron coloured. Rufescent. You know, I love the fact, it's like birders know words like crepuscular, which means appears at dawn or dusk. Barn owls are crepuscular. I love the fact we know these really weird words. And lots of birders who would say, well, I'm not educated. You know, I left school at 16. I don't, you know, they know these incredible words and names. I'll come to that later from something someone said. I mean, the warblers in America, black-throated green, citrine, golden cheek, green tail, grey and gold, and the tanagers. Oh, God, I was in Ecuador, the tanagers. Golden nape, golden headed, you know, just endless colour ones. So we have a lot of colour names. But also we have names where there's a colour, but something else that isn't quite right. And we had it in black redstart. Redstart. So called, of course, because it's quite startling. It moves, it's quite what's the word? You know, it moves around a bit. No, it doesn't. All birds do that. Why is it called a redstart? I only found out after I'd written the book. Someone said to me, oh, yeah, like Start Point in Devon, or Sturt. Sturt is actually closer to the Anglo-Saxon. This would have been, in Anglo-Saxon, the red stort. And red stort means red tail. And the Normans turned up and language changed, and Anglo-Saxon names weren't understood anymore. Very, very quickly, within about 2 centuries. So even though lots of Anglo-Saxon words retained in English, a lot of them weren't, and stilt was one of those. Another one was yellowhammer. Yellowhammer. Is it called yellowhammer because is it percussive? Does it bash around? No, of course not. It's yellowhammer, which is the German word for bunting. In German, it's actually called the goldhammer because they don't see yellow, they see gold, which is fair enough. And the final one, wheatear. And this, of course, is a very famous one because wheatear is a putative Anglo-Saxon word. We don't actually have the word itself, but the word we think was wheatios, which means white horse, because it has a white rump. And there's a poem I quote in this book from the 18th century or 17th century where this guy says, you know, wheatears are so called because, you know, they feed on ears of wheat. No, they don't. But it's interesting how names last much longer than other words. And one good example is there are 3 groups of birds, and I use groups loosely. It's sort of sorry, I've just knocked the thing off. That was overexcited, wasn't it? Families. Oh, no, we're just going to lose it. Families or groups within families that have old French names. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to what they are? 3 groups of British birds that have old French names in a way that blackcap clearly isn't old French. Ducks. Mallard just means male duck. Shoveler, shovelard. Gadwall, widgeon. Gargan is actually Italian, but they came into English after the Norman conquest. Game birds, pheasant, quail, partridge. You know partridge in a pear tree? It's not. It's a partridge and a perdrix. Perdrix is the French name for partridge. So partridge, quail and pheasant come from perdrix, caille and faisan. Pardon my French. What do you think the third group would be? We've got 2 sets of birds there that are quite good to eat. Falcons, thank you, yes. Well, all birds of prey actually, eagle, buzzard, but particularly falcons. This is a hobby. Hobby comes from a lovely French, old French obsolete word, aubert, which means to leap around, because you watch a hobby and it moves very quickly. Anyone know the story of a man after the war called Peter Adolf, who went along to the patent office with his new game for boys, and it was for boys at the time. And he walked in and the man said, oh yes, sir, what would you like to call your game, sir? And he was a birder, and he said, I want to call it the hobby. Oh, you can't do that, sir. We'd have people coming in calling things game. We can't do that. You can't call it hobby. So he turned around and said, quick as a flash, subutio. Because subutio is the Latin name of the hobby, and it means little buzzard. Buteo, meaning buzzard. And why were these 3 groups of birds then? Ducks, basically wildfowl, particularly ducks, game birds, and birds of prey, falcons especially. Why do they have old French names? Kestrel, peregrine, merlin, hobby. Because they were used for falconry and the other things were eaten, okay? But why would they still, that still doesn't quite explain, does it? Except that I went into a pub tonight and I had I actually had a steak pie, but I could have had a beef and ale pie, a beef pie. If I'd said to the guy behind the bar, can I have a cow pie, please? He'd have given me a very funny look, wouldn't he? Because cow is the English name given by the Anglo-Saxon peasants who had to raise the thing, and beef is the French name from the posh noblemen from Normandy who ate it. And it's the same with these birds. So there we are, a bit of history. There are some very obvious bird names. Blackbird. Or are they? Hang on, didn't we just see a number of very, very obviously black birds? Rook, crow, raven, and you could argue jackdaw. So why on earth would someone give the name blackbird to a bird when there's so many other blackbirds? Surely that's confusing. The clue is the name bird. The name bird derives from the same origin as the words brood and breed. And it was brid in Anglo-Saxon, and brid meant a young bird, a baby bird. What were birds called? We still use it. Adult birds. Fowl. As in wildfowl. We still say wildfowl, don't we? And waterfowl and peafowl. In fact, the peacock and peahen are peafowl. But fowl is not a word we tend to use. But fowl was the name. Parliament of Fowls in Chaucer. So fowl was the name for these birds. And what happened is around the 13th century, and we don't know quite when, the word bird stopped being used just for baby birds and was adopted for any what we'd call today songbirds. So thrushes, tits, finches, warblers, blackbirds, whatever. So hang on, aren't crow and raven and all the crows, which are black, aren't they also songbirds? Technically, they're passerines. Yes, they are, but they don't look like it, do they? They look like big, hefty birds. And an old cameraman I used to work with, Scott Tibbles, son of the famous Maurice Tibbles, used to have two kinds of birds. And we'd say to him, can you film that bird? He'd go, which one, the budgie or the shite hawk? And budgie was anything little, and shite hawk was everything else. Gulls, terns, waders, penguins, you name it. And it's a good distinction because actually it's the distinction between fowl and bird. Or was, and then bird. I need to go the other day, I'm writing a book about the starling. Oh, I mustn't tell you that. My publisher will be really upset. No, people do know. My next biography is going to be the starling. Starling, of course, is from the same root as duckling and gosling, and it means baby bird. So a starling was a baby stare, S-T-A-R-E. And yet the word stare disappeared, and the word starling took over for all starlings. That's another odd example, isn't it? Where gosling and duckling, mean baby birds still. I love language. Third category, behaviour. Name some birds named after their behaviour. Wagtail, very good, yes. And in Australia, the willy wagtail, which is not a wagtail at all, but looks like one. Sorry? Dipper, yeah. Shoveler, yes. And what was shoveler also used for? Do you know what the bird shoveler was used for? We were talking about it earlier. Spoonbill. So the shoveler is a duck, but shovelard and shoveler were also used for the spoonbill. And then it was given just to the duck. Sorry? Weaver bird. God, you're very good, aren't you? You're not coming up with the three really obvious ones because you're a knowledgeable audience. Thank you. Woodpecker. What are the other two? Also found in woods. Tree creeper and nuthatch. Hang on, nuthatch. Does it sit on acorns? No, it's nuthack. It's from the same root as hatchet. It hacks at the acorn or the nut to open it with that amazing bill. Tree creeper wasn't tree creeper until the 1880s. It was creeper, just creeper. So bird names do change, but we'll come to that. Now, by now, we've had names, I'm going to summarise. We've had three categories. We've had sound, appearance, colour, shape, etc., and behaviour. And lots of birds named after behaviour. Again, three things that people can see. Three things that are clearly effectively folk names. Tree creeper is not a scientific name. But by now, by the 18th century, birds are being named by ornithologists. People like Thomas Pennant. So the white-fronted goose, the black-tailed godwit, the red-necked phalarope. That actually has a Latin name. In South America, they have Chloraspingus, which is also called what's it called? Something bushweaver. But Chloraspingus, the Latin name, is still used. Phalarope's a Latin name. my favourite bird name, and they're in the back of the book, Oleaginous hemispingus. If you ask nicely, I'll read you out the funny bird names at the end. So then we got a category that is probably on the edge of birds named after people, named by people, by folk and scientists. So the reed sparrow, which isn't a bird now, was used for reed bunting, reed warbler. You know, it was used for any sedge warbler. It was used for any small bird that lived in reeds that was brown. Hedge sparrow, of course, was used for the dunnock. But birds started being named after where they live, their habitat. So I mentioned willow warbler earlier, sedge warbler, willow tit. Willow tit's wrong, it should be marsh tit, and marsh tit should be oak tit. It's a long story, it's in the book. Then birds started being named after places. And if you were going to change any bird names, and I'm not completely against the American OU's view that we should be changing what we call eponyms, and I'll come to these. But the fifth category is places. But these are birds named after the place, and it tends to, it sometimes is the place where they live, like Arctic skua or Mediterranean gull, or American redstart, indeed. But generally, they're hopelessly bad names. And there are 3 birds named after one county in Britain. Yeah. So we have, oh no, that's sedge warbler and willow tit. The Dartford warbler, shot in Bexley Heath, next to Dartford. So why isn't it the Bexley Heath warbler? It should be called the furze wren, which is an old name for it, or the furze warbler. Anything with a cocktail was called wren, anything with a pink breast was called a robin. Anything that was brown was called a sparrow, you know. That's how folk name. Well, and then the names were adopted officially by people like Thomas Pennant and John Latham, who discovered these 3. I don't think he actually shot them, but he sent someone else out. So Dartford warbler, hopeless, not found anywhere near Dartford. Sandwich tern, because of course it eats fish, but was shot at Sandwich in Kent. And Kentish plover. There was one, we had a Kentish plover for 4 winters down at Burnham, which was lovely, beautiful little bird, but hopeless, not found in Kent, did breed in Kent until 1956. So if we're going to change bird names, maybe we should change these. However, we need to be a bit careful changing bird names. Firstly, how many birds on the British list do you think are named after people? Roughly. It keeps changing because they keep finding new birds, but it's around 55, named after around 48, I think, people, because things like Benelli's warbler, there's 2 of them, or Blythe has a couple of things named after him, Blythe's pipit and Blythe's reed warbler. How many are named after women of those 50-something? No, 3, amazingly, but they're really obscure. Blackburnian warbler, after Anna Blackburn, who was a real pioneer, lovely American bird. Eleanor's falcon, named after a 14th century princess in Sardinia who protected them. And Lady Amherst pheasant, named after the wife of the Governor General of India who was given the 2 pheasants. So of course they're named after men. Why? Because they're all named in the 18th and 19th centuries, and men were doing the exploring. The women weren't allowed out. You know, it was a classic patriarchy, and therefore they're all named after men. And they're named in unusual ways. Now, very few of them are common British birds. Here's an unusual example, though, because this is Chetty's warbler. Simon Barnes said it's saying, and he said he was told this by a nun, me, Chetty, if you don't like it, sod off. Only it wasn't sod. Chetty's warbler, quite a common bird now, all over the levels. You hear it everywhere. You don't see it very often, but you hear it everywhere. Only bird that sings every month of the year in Britain. Robins and wrens stop in summer, they don't. I checked my notes. Always good to keep notes because I checked that and found that. Chetty's warbler is the exception that proves the rule, in that it is a bird that was unbelievably, it wasn't even rare in Britain, it was unknown the year I was born, 1960. There were no Chetty's warblers ever seen in Britain. In 1961, one of them turned up. By the early 70s, they were breeding in Kent, and I used to cycle down there with my friend Daniel and hear them and occasionally see them. But almost all the other birds named after people are either imports, like Lady Amherst pheasant, which was brought here, released, put on the British list, and then promptly went extinct. Montagu's harrier doesn't breed in Britain anymore. Bird named after a person, very eminent ornithologist, who discovered it and realized, he called it the ash-colored falcon. He realized that the male and female hen harriers and Montagu's harriers were not, they thought there was a grey species with a white rump, which was the males, and a brown species with a white rump, which was the females. He realized that you're looking at two different species where the male and female are very different. Very interesting man. I like George Montagu. There he is. I like Montagu because he was very frustrated. He had a midlife crisis. He wrote to Gilbert White, who was very elderly by that stage, and said, I wish, like you, I could ride my hobby into distant parts. He then had an affair with a fellow officer's wife, got court-martialed, moved to the West Country and spent the rest of his life writing books on birds. Which is not entirely different from my own career, only it wasn't a fellow officer's wife, but you know, you get there. Yes. And I like Montagu. He was a difficult bastard, basically, but not as difficult as this man. This man's one of my great heroes, William McGillivray. And now we come to the controversy, the tidying up of bird names. Now, there have been some tidying up of bird names around the world in the last few years. For example, there were some blackbirds in small black finches in southern Africa called Negro finches. And that has now been changed, quite rightly. The Hottentot teal or Hottentot duck will have to be changed because Hottentot is not a tribe that is, or a group of people that is recognized anymore. There are some, not in English, but there are names in Sweden of, I can't remember what the bird is, but it uses the insult kafir, which is a very nasty insult in Africa, K-A-F-F-I-R. In America, they changed Old Squaw, which was the long-tailed name for the long-tailed duck, a bird we're very familiar with. They changed it to long-tailed duck, partly because it tidies it up, but partly because it was considered offensive to Native Americans, which it may well be. And recently, and the problem in America is that almost all the men, and they were all men who had birds named after them, were either Confederates or slave owners, including Audubon, John James Audubon, the great artist, who is probably mixed race because his father had an affair with a maid in Haiti, and I don't suppose she was a white North American. So that's interesting, or a white French woman. But the Audubon Society are seriously considering changing their name. And this, like with Edward Colston and all these things, this causes massive controversy. And I'm a real wet liberal. I feel bad that I don't feel worse. I can always see both sides of the story. And I think if a name is genuinely offensive, and McCown, who was a rather nasty piece of work, who had a longspur, a kind of bunting named after him in America, it's been changed to thick-billed longspur. And I think that's probably a good thing. However, the AOU has now said it's going to change all eponyms. So however reasonable it is to call a bird by that person's name, they're going to drop them. Now, that's fine, but one of the people commenting on this made the remark that bird names don't mean anything. They're just like a, what's the word? Like a sort of symbol we give the bird. So we can just change them. Well, I point you to William McGillivray, who back in the 1850s was writing his history of British birds and decided correctly that most English bird names are really stupid. So yeah, you're a beginner bird. You're reading this book and you see whitethroat. What's that? If it was called the white-throated warbler, you'd understand that it was related to willow warblers and sedge warblers, although of course it's not, because new biology has discovered that the warblers that we think of as one group are actually 8 different groups, and they're not related to each other at all. But that's another story. So McGillivray said, right, we're going to call the red-winged thrush, the blackbird, the black thrush. He changed every name. Wheatear was white-rumped stonechat. Dartford warbler was Provence fursling, which is insane. He literally changed the lot. So his book came out with all these new names and everyone went, no, we're not going to say that. And bird names do change. Golden crested wren is not used anymore for the gold crest. It's in very old books. Hedge sparrow, which many of you like me would have grown up with, is not used anymore. We use dunnock. But the trouble with changing them wholesale is as soon as you do that, you do what happened 150 years later. British Birds magazine tried to change things. They changed skylark to sky, pause, gap, lark, because it doesn't fit with woodlark and shorelark and all the other larks. But it's the skylark, for God's sake. It's in poetry. You can't suddenly put a gap in between it. Some of these name changes are, of course, again, and this may well happen in America. I think people may get used to them. They may change them, but it's going to cause a lot of confusion and a lot of mess. We did try to change some names because one of the things that you probably may not even have noticed if you're British, and I appreciate not all of you are, we call things, don't we? Swallow, kingfisher, teal, coot, jay. There's hundreds of them. There are dozens of swallows around the world. There's dozens of wheatears. But we only have one of all these things. So because we name them first, we just say swallow. Now we often say barn swallow. If you're birding abroad in America, you'll say, oh, I saw a barn swallow, because you know that there's 5 or 6 other species that could confuse it with. But so those names did sort of get adopted, but they get adopted when you're abroad. When you're here, no one says, oh, northern wheatear, because they're not going to be any other wheatear normally. Ditto kingfisher. People don't say European or Eurasian kingfisher or Eurasian jay. British Birds tried to change it to acorn jay and things like that, and it didn't work. Anyway, that's my little rant of the day. Which brings us to Mrs. Moreau's Warbler. I showed my son the book, George, when he was about 10 when it came out, and he said, another book about the robin then? That's not robin. Yes, it is. It duets. This is it. Duetting. Anyway, I went to Tanzania on what Mrs. Moss calls a jolly. By the way, the book is dedicated to Suzanne, after whom one day I hope to name a new species of warbler. She read that and went, you're going off again then. I'm pleased some people. I first read about Mrs. Moreau's Warbler in 1970 when I was 10 years old, got Birds of the World. It didn't have every bird in it. It was a magazine. You may remember it, a part work, 3 and 6 a week. And my mum used to buy it and give it to me. And it had a list of all the birds in each section. And then it would feature 3 or 4 of them. And I was looking down the warblers, and there was Mrs. Moreau's Warbler. And I thought, what a bizarre name. And then I found out about Mrs. Moreau. She's an amazing woman. It's called Winifred. The other name of the bird now is Winifred's Warbler. And she and Reg, her husband, moved to Tanzania and started a very interesting study of both the migrants coming from Europe and Asia there, but also the local birds in the Uluguru Mountains, which is it's called the Galapagos of Africa. It's very diverse, it's very different. And so they moved there and they found Mrs. Moreau's Warbler, and he named it after her, which I think is terribly romantic. The sad thing is she was very much an equal partner in their work. But when his book came out, which was after he died, she got the credit within the book. He wrote about it, but she didn't get a credit in the title page, which she really should have done. I had a lovely moment about 2 months ago. I got an email out of the blue from Mrs. Moreau and Reg Moreau's grandson, Stephen, who's my age and remembers them very well. The great James Ferguson Lees said, Reg was a god to us young ornithologists, remarkable man. My friend said he looked a bit like, saw a photo of him, he looked a bit like Arthur Lowe, Captain Mannering in Dad's Army. And he did, but he had a better sense of humour than that. But I went there, and I'm just going to read, I think we've got 2 minutes left just about. I'm just going to read the end of the book, because when you write a book, you always ask yourself, what's it about? It's about bird names, about the history of bird names. That's simple. What's it really about? What this book's really about is our extraordinary cultural link with all these birds through their names. And the fact that Mrs. Moreau's Warbler is likely to go extinct in the next few years. There's only about 500 left on one mountain range. is, I suppose, what the book's really about. I went up there, we walked up this mountain, we kept stopping on the way, we were tired, we had to have a rest, a drink, it was getting later and later, I didn't think we were going to see the bird, and we finally got there, and I'm just going to read this bit. Then, just as I'd almost given up hope, Elia, our guide, pauses and gestures urgently down below us. He thinks he's heard the warbler's call. We step off the path into the forest, treading carefully on the uneven and treacherous ground. I look up momentarily and notice that we seem to be heading towards a small patch where two saplings have grown across one another to form a distinctive X-shaped cross. And then I hear it for myself, the unmistakable notes of not just one, but two birds, a breeding pair performing together in a synchronized duet. Then Elia suddenly grabs my arm. There, there! And at that point, I can't see the bloody thing. And I'm terrible out in the field, in jungles particularly. And suddenly, Roy, our other guide, and Graham and Kevin, my friends, are doing high fives at the back. They're looking at this bird and I still can't see it. My heavy breathing has made my lenses fog up and I now face the real prospect that everyone else will see the bird I've travelled so far to find, but that I shall miss out. I take a deep breath and try to stop panicking. Then I hear Graham's calm, reassuring Scottish brogue. Look, Stephen, there, X marks the spot. I look again at exactly the point where the two branches cross, and sitting right out in the open, so obvious I can't believe I've taken so long to see it, is a small, slender bird. As if to acknowledge me, it utters one more burst of song and then melts back into the forest. It has been a long time coming, about 50 years, but Mrs. Moreau's warbler is finally, as birders say, in the bag. And I walk back and I step back from the others. And I was really quite emotional about this because this bird probably won't last my lifetime. It might do. And that's such a tragedy because when we lose a bird, you know, the dodo, as someone said, it might have been invented for the sole purpose of becoming extinct. You know, the dodo has become this icon of extinction. We can't say the word dodo without thinking that anymore. And I've seen quite a few birds around the world. I saw one 2 weeks ago in Ecuador, the black-breasted puffleg, this beautiful, tiny, dark hummingbird with little leg warmers around its legs, which genuinely are leg warmers. They're like its feathers because it lives at 10,000 feet up. And there's 100 of those left. And it's probably, no one knows why, because it's a hummingbird, for God's sake. You know, they nectar. It's not like there's no nectar there, but for some reason it is going. And I think, I suppose, and it's probably what I'm going to write in my next book, is this idea that birds matter. I suppose the older I get, the more I'm writing histories. And this is a history, and 10 Birds That Changed the World is a history. And they're about why birds matter to us, why these and other wildlife are not just some sort of add-on. And so that's really why I wrote the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. I am going to take some questions in the room, but just before I do so, Siobhan asks on the chat, and this was when you were talking about French names. Does tit come from tet? Tit. Is that a French?
No, tit comes from titmouse, which means little thing. So mouse, it is just a word that means small thing, and tit is another diminutive. So it's an interesting one in that in obviously both the word titmouse and tit don't really, they sort of don't make sense anymore, but you have to look at what they come from originally.
Right. Any questions in the audience? I will, we have one over here.
What do you think of the argument by the, I think it was the ARU, it might have been someone in commenting to the ARU, that the reason that they're changing all of the names that were named for people is that they don't want to have the debate for every single species if that person is worthy of having a bird.
I think that's a very valid point. And, you know, you're absolutely right. Montague deserves his name. Bewick, who named the Bewick swan, very fine man, but he never knew anything about Bewick swans. So it is, I mean, Gilbert White is named after, one bird's named after him, the most famous naturalist ever in the world, probably, apart from David Attenborough, White's thrush. He never saw it, he never knew about it. So yeah, the problem is almost all bird names are stupid. Grey wagtail's a stupid name. You know, American redstart's a beautiful bird, but it's a warbler. Why isn't it called American red-tailed warbler? You know, why is it, you know? They do. They do. And they've nearly all got colour names because they're very colourful. American birders always say they're really confusing. It's like, you haven't looked at our warblers, which are just dull. Yours are beautiful. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a very valid point. I just think they're really going to struggle trying to find new names.
Thank you. This isn't a very learned, I'm not a great bird watcher or anything like that. I'm interested in them, but not an expert. But we often get two names for the same bird, maybe a childlike name that you'd get in a storybook, and one that comes to mind is Dabchick.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Dabchick's a good one because Dabchick is the little grebe. Dabchick is a folk name that we still quite often use. I'll sometimes say, well, there's a dabchick, and it means dip chick. It means it looks like a chick and it dives into the water. Interestingly, two names that are often used, one particularly is used by birders, is bonksy for great skewer and taisty for black guillemot. Taisty is an Icelandic name, taista. Bonksy is used, but we don't use Piriduk for redneck phalarope, which is another Shetland name. So it is weird. But yeah, they're basically folk names, like people say peewit, but then lapwing's a folk name as well. So whereas little grebe isn't a folk name. Does that make sense? You know, but yeah, I think we also have our own names for birds. David Lindo, my friend, used to say that as a kid growing up, he didn't know what the birds were. So he called blackbirds daddy birds, starlings mummy birds, and sparrows baby birds, which actually makes a huge amount of sense. You know, and I love that. You know, we all have our own little ways.
Before my question, I just wanted to share that there's a name I like, the blacksmith bird in Africa.
Yes.
So called, I understand, because you know, the sound it makes sounds like a hammer hitting an anvil.
Exactly. Blacksmith plover, or
yeah.
blacksmith lapwing now, because it's really a lapwing. But yeah.
So my question is, I'm always struck by how colourful some of the collective nouns are for birds. I wondered if you had any insights on those.
Well, things like murder of crows, parliament of rooks. The interesting one is murmuration of starlings, because it's very hard to tell, and I've been looking into this in some detail with the Oxford English Dictionary. Does it refer to the flight? Because you know when they fly over, if you've been down to Hamburg, when they fly over your head, you hear just before they go over your head, you hear whoosh, and it's their wings. And I think that's murmuration. It's become used in the last 20 years. It's become a popular word. It was never used before. People would never have known it. I didn't know when I was growing up. To mean the performance they do when they fly around. And I've also heard people say, oh, look, a murmuration of waders, because Dunlin and Avocets murmurate, you know. So yeah, I think there's a lot of good ones and there's a lot of slightly weird ones. There are books on these things, you know, there are dictionaries on this. I was very keen not to write a dictionary for this book because I think there's enough of those, including a very good one on scientific names by Michael James Jobling, which is incredibly rigorous and has virtually every scientific name that there is.
Birds like Mrs. Moreau's warblers, who are going to become extinct, you say, are there no breeding pairs that are being protected, like other birds have been sort of protected and looked after and nurtured and have come back in great numbers?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's very hard to protect small birds that live short lives. It's very easy to protect things like cranes or, well, not easy, albatrosses, but it's not that easy to protect them. What's happening in Tanzania, I say this in the book, we walked up the hill and of course the farming was going higher and higher up the hill for two reasons. One, because people are very hungry, because Tanzania is a very poor country, and two, because of climate change. So they're able to go higher up the mountain. So it's an isolated bird. When a population drops below a certain amount, and scientists will know the figure, and I think it varies from species to species, once it gets to the low hundreds, it's very hard to bring it back. Having said that, the great Carl Jones did it in Mauritius with 5 or 4 Mauritius kestrels and brought them back. I was told it'll never work, don't do it, waste of money, in the 1970s, and he brought them back. So, you know, it can be done, but with small birds, it's much harder because they can be wiped out very quickly, you know, a disease or a storm or whatever. I might be being pessimistic about Mrs. Moreau's warbler, but it has a very small range. So that's the problem.
Thank you. I might be very ignorant here, but do birds have Latin names?
Yes, yes.
So, I mean,
that's a very good
a lot
point,
of the
yeah.
Latin names are named after people in plants anyway, but
Yes.
does that happen in Latin
It
names?
does, and the American Ornithological Union have said we're not going to change the scientific names for that reason. So hang on, so why not? Because if you're going to, you should. Scientific names shouldn't be changed, but as you know, I'm sure they are all the time. And recently, all the tits, most of the tits, not long-tailed and bearded, which were in the genus Parus, great titties now in the genus Parus. All the others are in the genus, I can't even remember the name, Pucile or something for blue tail, I can't even pronounce it. Gulls, they've done the same. Latin names are almost as, or scientific names, they should be called, some are Greek, are almost as stupid as English names. So laughing gull, sorry, black-headed gull is Larus ridibundus, which means, except it's not anymore, it's something else. But anyway, ridibundus, which means laughing gull. Laughing gull is something else. Mediterranean gull doesn't. No, laughing gull is melanocephalus, which means black-headed. You know, it's just, anyway. So yes, but they all have them because Linnaeus named the lot. And which is why thrush nightingale, the more obscure northern cousin of the nightingale, is Lucinia lucinia, because it lived in Sweden. And Hooper swan is Cygnus cygnus, and nightingale and mute swan are not. Thank you. Yes, I should have said that. I studied Latin for a year and no Greek, and I should have done, because it would have helped with this book.
Just an observation about cuckoos. Some years ago, I was in the Masai Mara, and one of the local Masai wildlife guides pointed at a picture of a cuckoo in a textbook, in a field guide. And he said, why are these called cuckoos? And of course, again, the realization struck me that in their wintering territory, they don't actually make that noise at all. And so, of course, the Maasai wouldn't know them as cuckoos.
And there are dozens of other species of cuckoo in Africa and indeed in North America, yellow-billed cuckoo, black-billed cuckoo. So they've all got this, and they're all saddled with this name because we did it first. I can be jingoistic because I'm half Italian, so I can do it. But, so yeah, it is very, there is no consistency to bird names. That's if there's a lesson from this book, that is it. Absolutely none. But that's a very interesting question that wouldn't occur to us, would it? That's like when I went to Africa and I came back and I said to people, where do our swallows go in the winter, go for the winter? And they all said Africa. I said, no, they don't. They go there for the summer. Because they do.
Surely duck is onomatopoeic, isn't it?
Duck might be onomatopoeic, yes, yeah, actually. But things like sparrow, starling, I mean, there's a great man, he's dead now, called W.B. Lockwood, who was a philologist at Reading, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Oxford Dictionary of Bird Names. And he claims in it things like wren is a reference to the sticking up tail, and swallow is to do with the forked tail. But he doesn't provide any very obvious evidence in any ancient Indo-European language that proves that. You know, if he thinks swallow means cleft stick in some long lost Proto-Indo-European, and it's like, well, it might do, but who knows? But yes, duck could be, couldn't it? Sorry, Jonathan.
Sorry, a second bite at the cherry. Has it ever worked back? I'm just interested in the etymology. Does it ever work backwards, like from the way a bird behaves, and then it goes into the English, into the language You know,
Oh,
like,
yes, yes,
for
yes.
example, to gull somebody
Yes.
is to swindle them or something. And cuckoo, oh, he's mad, he's
Yeah.
cuckoo. You know,
Cuckoo's a
does
good
it-
example where it does, because they thought they were mad because they called all the time. Sniper, a very good shooter, is someone who can shoot snipe, because snipe are the hardest bird to shoot, because they're off. Crane and kite come from the bird name. So crane is shaped like a crane, and a kite, the choice flies like a kite. But there are some in the book, I can't remember them. There is examples where the connection is not there. Gull, I think, is one of them. I think gulling someone is not a derivative of the bird name. Obviously, with any language, it's very hard to tell. So, but that's a very good point. Yeah, it's all in the book, which I only have one copy of actually, but you can buy it from all good bookshops, including obviously Toppings and Mr. B's.
Can I ask about my favourite bird name, which is capercaillie?
Yes, capercaillie.
Is that French or is
No,
it?
it's Gallic.
So okay.
Scottish Gaelic, and it means wild horse of the woods, because it makes a whinnying sound like a horse. Little Greaves make a whinnying sound. I always call Little Greaves My Little Pony, dab chicks, because they go.
Any other questions? Oh, one at
One at
the back. Hold on.
Once we've done questions, I'm going to read you my 30 favourite bird names. 33, sorry.
Is it switched? It is switched on. This is more of an observation. I'm from Tunbridge Wells originally. Somebody has to be. And Subbuteo was based at Langton Green, which is just outside Tunbridge Wells. And when I was at grammar school, if you wanted some money, you approached Subbuteo, who paid you the princely sum of 1 9d to paint a whole team. Just imagine painting Sheffield United.
What?
11 players for 1 9d.
All those stripes.
Most boys did one team and handed it all back.
Mind you, 1 9d. You could have got a taxi up to town. You could have had a night out.
My other observation is I actually live in Hungary most of the time, and Fatsan is pheasant in Hungarian. And that's the only bird name, which bears any resemblance to any other European bird name.
Yes.
Because they came from the Fazani Mountains.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's
I didn't
the
know
same word right across Europe. That's
Gosh.
how you know it. The Romans, I think, brought them.
Yeah, yes, almost
Yeah.
certainly, yeah.
Yeah.
How lovely.
Thank you. Oh, question
Gentleman here.
Oh, Martin, hold on, Martin, hold on. So we can.
Thank you. This is almost certainly the stupidest question you've ever been asked.
I've been asked a lot of stupid questions, and they never are.
Is there a reason why that warbler on the screen is called Mrs. Moreau's warbler rather than Madame Moreau?
Because she was English. But you're right, Reg Moreau's name came from a Huguenot family that had come over in the 1850s. So his grandparents or great-grandparents were French. Yes, so it should be.
But would it not be better for it to be called Madame Moreau's warbler?
But she wasn't known as that. She was always known as Mrs.
I
Moreau.
understand.
Yeah. Or Winifred, as I say, Winifred.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. I think we this is the moment to draw things to a conclusion. You wanted to read your
I'm just gonna read-
33.
Yeah, I've got a whole load of lists in the back, including birds named after man-made objects. What are the 3 birds in the world named after something they produce for us, and don't say turkey? Honey Guy's good. Yes, that almost made it, because it's a good one, because yes, you could argue that. The ones I've got in that book are oilbird, edible nest swiftlet, and my favourite, of course, the only bird named after shit, the guanay cormorant. Good story. That's in that book. Right, here are my 33 amazing names, and frankly, I could have picked another 33 and another 33, but they are banana quit, bearded mountaineer, which is a hummingbird, bukikokiko, bokmakiari. Obviously, some of these are names used in English, but they are from things like various languages. Brownish twistwing, Chuck Will's widow, an American nightjar, crinkle-collared manucode, fasciated tiger heron, firewood gatherer, 40-spotted pardalote, which I'm hoping to see in Tasmania in January, giant cowbird, glowing puffleg, hardhead, horn screamer, kinglet calptura, lachrymose mountain tanager, leaf love, Luzon bleeding heart, marvellous spatule tail, another hummingbird, pink-legged gravitera, rock-loving cisticola, which Bill Oddie used to say, does it play a electric guitar, scaly-throated leaf tosser, which I saw the other day, I actually saw scaly-throated leaf tosser, screaming peaha, sharp-tailed stream creeper, shining sunbeam, which I also saw, lovely hummingbird, strange-tailed tyrant, which I didn't know but is in Argentina, teardrop white-eye, upper Magdalena tapaculo, vermiculated screech owl, whippoorwill, zigzag heron, zitting cisticola, and my absolute favourite weird bird name, Oleaginous hemispingus. On that note.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you.